So if I could get everyone to sit down, please, we'll start. Thank you. Right, well, let's now go to item 8, decision item 8, Deloitte peer review of HBRIC Ltd RWSS business case, and I'll hand that over to Mr Drury to introduce, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Chairman. Just as a very brief introduction, you're aware Deloitte have been commissioned to do the peer review of the business case. The interim report was on the 16th of April. This report was supposed to be their final report, but as they've indicated in their conclusion, and then as we've set out in this paper, there's 3 moving parts still moving. Construction contract is still there, a few bits and bobs to be looked at there. Certainly the level of water is yet to be contracted, and that will be resolved over the ensuing months, and also the capital structure is probably one of the most important things that Deloitte need to look at when it's finalised, and that's Crown input and the independent parties that will contribute to this investment. So once they have been decided, Deloitte will need to once again review it for council and come back and say what terms and conditions are the Crown on board for and private investors, and our recommendations. Liz and I have put in a recommendation there that indeed we note that further work will need to be done, and Deloitte will need to come back with a further report. So, having said that, let's hand over to Alan and David and for the second iteration.
Okay, thanks, Paul. What we'd intended to do was just flick through a bit of an introduction and then probably pull out some of the, I guess, what we see as being some of the more pivotal elements of the report, just to talk a little bit more through those. But obviously, the report itself is a reasonably substantial document, and understand that folk may want to either raise questions in relation to the substantive report, or as we work our way through and focus on some of these, what we see as being some of the more key issues, to discuss those. And obviously, once we get to the tail end of the presentation, have a further conversation if that's what people want to do. So I'll just sort of press on, but as I say, happy to take questions as we work our way through. So, and I think the first point is salient, and it gets back to a couple of points that Paul has made, is that clearly what we've reviewed has been a base case, which in turn is based on a set of key assumptions in relation to capital cost and risk sharing, investment structure, and that's both terms and mix, operating costs and farmer uptake. And obviously, around that base case, we've examined a range of scenarios in terms of what would happen if scenario X arose, just to try and demonstrate how returns to HBRIC and cash flows vary under those scenarios. But obviously that base case itself is a bit of a moving feast, and that's not a criticism of anyone, that's just the way these projects unfold. And there have been, I guess, a few developments along the way that have influenced that as well. So, just to bear that in mind. But in that context, in relation to the base case, we can conclude the draft construction contract does limit HBRC's exposure to the risk of capital cost overruns and performance issues, and that's, I guess, one of the key benefits of a design and build contract, that these days that is typically the way these complex sort of projects are undertaken, and in our experience they do serve to mitigate very significantly that construction risk, and certainly the way the contract, as the draft contract is currently structured, appears to achieve that, but subject to the fact that that contract is yet to be concluded. A second important point is that at full uptake, the project is financially viable without the need for subsidised public capital. Again, pretty key point, because it's really, the need for that public subsidy is the fact that you don't have full uptake at day one, and so that's really what the purpose of that subsidised capital is to achieve, rather than to underwrite a fundamentally, a scheme that's fundamentally unviable. So that's a pretty critical comment. So just reinforcing that point, that the subsidised public capital is required because full uptake is not expected at practical completion. So at the time the scheme is ready to go, expectations at this stage notwithstanding where pre-contractual volumes are likely to be, it's not expected you will have moved from that go-no-go point to full uptake over the construction period. Clearly, the structure of the proposed Crown Irrigation Investment Limited capital is important in managing that uptake risk. So effectively, there are two elements of public capital in this process. That's the capital that the council is considering contributing, and clearly the other major material element is the capital from Crown Irrigation. Crown Irrigation was set up essentially for this purpose, in the sense that a lot of work by Treasury and others have sort of indicated that irrigation has a material impact or potential to materially impact on national GDP over a period of time. The Crown established Crown Irrigation Investments to effectively help seed the funding for schemes, for irrigation schemes, and therefore, almost by definition, its mandate is to come in behind private capital to try and get schemes underway. But it is the last cab off the rank in many respects. So until you lock down the other dimensions of your capital structure, Crown Irrigation is really the last cab off the rank. And so the quantum and the terms under which Crown Irrigation come in, are clearly, both indicative, confidential, but obviously the final form of those will need to be scrutinised, because that will have implications potentially for the position of HBRIC. So just wanted to make the point that that's an important element, and goes back to Paul's point that just the form of that capital structure is one of those pieces that understandably is still moving around. Until that's locked down, it's impossible to form an absolutely definitive view on the implications of an investment for HBRIC for the council. That said, the key project risk itself, continues, as pointed out in our previous meeting, to uptake, and probably more around the timing of that uptake rather than do you think you'll eventually get to uptake if experience of other schemes is any indication. But nonetheless, that is the fundamental financial risk to the scheme, and hence that's the risk that's really been underwritten by that public capital. So, just linking back again, while we've reviewed a base case, this is unlikely to be the final investment case for the RWSS, primarily because there are a number of material matters that have yet to be finalised, including, firstly, the construction contract. That said, the contract in the form it's at now, is materially complete, would be our assessment, but obviously nothing's finalised until the ink's dry. But I think in terms of looking at the project today, you can have a reasonable degree of confidence that that's there or thereabouts. But as I say, things can move, and until these things are actually locked away and signed, you can't be definitive. The next points are pretty fundamental. Clearly, not only the quantum of investment, but the terms of those investments will be important, because they serve both in terms of helping to determine how much capital you may need in from Crown Irrigation, but also the investment terms will be potentially have an implication for HBRIC in terms of the risk it takes in relation to the project. So until those investment terms are finalised, it's hard to be definitive, or you can't be definitive about the risk that HBRIC or Crown Irrigation are actually assuming. Obviously, the Board of Inquiry determination's pretty critical, and particularly in terms of sort of where things sit around in relation to nutrient levels, and that's I know that that's a topic that you folk will be covering separately, but nonetheless, clearly that will factor into the final point, which are I guess more the nature of farmer uptakes in the period through to financial close or potential financial close, noting that that's been extended to 30th of September, and so that's that extra 3 months we think in the ordinary course of affairs would be reasonably helpful in terms of getting more of that uptake locked down, given that we are asking farmers to make material decisions. These are sort of long-term contracts, and off the back of those contracts they do have to make considered decisions about implications for farming practice, investment, etc. And so these aren't straightforward. and so giving folk more time to consider those investments, what they're committing to, is helpful. But obviously, the caveat has to be what they can commit to, while you still have the implications of the Board of Inquiry decision hanging over folk, and so that will obviously have implications for the exact terms that people can sign up to at this stage. You've seen this graph previously. It was in, so basically we've worked, the business case and financial case is worked off a base case. That base case was developed by Castalia, and then with input from Trustpower, a couple of other scenarios were identified, being a high case which sort of drags that uptake forward, and then a low case which pushes that uptake out. And we've used those scenarios to help inform some of the sensitivity analysis we've done around the financial returns for HBRIC. But we have run some additional scenarios over and above these to sort of demonstrate, I guess, a more extreme downside scenario. As I say, the uptake. This is another diagram out of the report, and this really sort of demonstrates the way the uptake profile works, over the initial period up to trigger date. Just by way, just to be clear, the 2018 is a half year, and so just because of the way the timing comes in, and that ties up with revenue expectations. And then effectively, what you're seeing is you're locked in contracted period, contracted water holding holding constant over that period, and then the new water coming in, or new contracts coming in up to 2030, where you then get sort of 97% of 104 million cubes, which is what the financial case is based off. But obviously, while there's a small element of electricity revenue, fundamentally, revenue is driven off water contracts. And I guess that gets to the heart of the core financials of the business, which, as a business in itself at maturity, it's very simple. You've got a bunch of water a bunch of revenue that comes in from contracted water, and you have a relatively known modest set of operating costs. So at that point, you don't have a complicated business particularly, but the complicated piece is the front end. Ability to offlay. And establish a capital cost that can be covered at a point in time, and the ability to wrap an investment structure around that can get you over the line and get you underway. And then obviously, as you can see from the graph, just that gap from below that dotted line as you trend up towards a full uptake. But the business at maturity is not a complicated one. It's basically selling water and a relatively modest and known set of operating costs that sit underneath that revenue line. And so what we've set out here is just some extracts from the base case financial model, really trying to demonstrate the sort of cash flows that you'd be generating if you had 100% uptake as of today. And clearly you don't have that, but that's just to sort of demonstrate the gap that you get between that scenario and then sort of moving from left to right, where you anticipated to be in the first full year of operation, which is an operating profit before interest, tax and depreciation of about 10.5 million, and then the implications if you were only sticking at the 40 million cubes at that point, and then just showing over time the implications of the trend of full uptake, and then CPI coming in through to David, in the repayment of CII. And the end of that, and then obviously these cash flows are sort of trend up beyond that point. So really just to demonstrate what a theoretical business could look like at 100% uptake, but what you're more likely to do based on current expectations, and then how those change over time, but also the gap between what's expected or targeted to be contracted at financial close versus where it's expected that things will be post practical completion. So probably, David, if I just ask you to sort of work through the key, these are again some of the key diagrams that are included in the report that just try and give a little bit more insight around how the financials come together.